Okay, thank you. Welcome everyone. My name is Ayyā Dhammadīpā, and it is my honor to be here with you today. Thank you to Bhante Sumita, who I'm aware is actually taking care of some other Dhamma teaching right now, but many thanks to him for inviting me to come and share with you today. So my name is Ayyā Dhammadīpā, and I am here in Alexandria, Virginia, on the East Coast of the United States, just about 10 minutes drive outside of Washington, D.C. And a warm welcome to all of you, no matter what part of the world you're in. I hope that you are having a lovely day. A day full of Dhamma. So I've brought some more Dhamma to share with you. But before that, I want to go ahead and pay homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. One of the defining attributes of the human experience is our ability to reflect inwardly on our own mental experiences, our own mental processes. That is, we have the capacity for one aspect of the mind to observe another aspect of the mind. And that is a very important capacity that we have, one that, as far as we know, is not shared with animals, for example. Animals have feelings or have mental experience, but they do not have this ability to reflect back on that experience, to observe it and understand the mechanisms that are at work. We as human beings have that capacity, and the Buddha gave us quite a number of teachings that enable us to put that capacity to good use. He offered us teachings for using that capacity for reflection in ways that reduce the amount of suffering in ourselves and in those around us, and that support the arising of wisdom, the arising of awakened mind. But that takes some practice. So what is it that we observe? What is it that we can reflect on when we look at our own minds? I would suggest that it depends on how you look. What you see depends on how you look at the mind. So we begin with yoniso manasikara. We begin with wise attention. and we apply that wise attention in different ways. And so the Buddha gave a number of what I like to think of as frameworks or structures for this reflection on our mental and physical experience. And sometimes people refer to them as lists. We have various lists of things, of qualities of the mind or of the body. But really, I would propose that a skillful way of relating to them is that those are frameworks, structures that the Buddha offered so that we can begin to reflect on various aspects of our experience. First, we look at this, and then we look at this, and then we look at that. And that kind of structured approach will help us actually to make better sense of our, to make better sense of what we see, to actually know what to observe and how we can begin to relate to that wisely and skillfully. And one of the most important frameworks that the Buddha gave is the framework of the 5 khandhas. So khandhas is the word in Pali, skandhas is the word in Sanskrit. And even in his very first discourse, according to early Buddhism, the Buddha's first discourse was the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the sutta on the turning of the wheel, first turning of the wheel. And that's Samyutta Nikaya 5611. So in the linked discourses, is the way we translate that into English, linked discourse, book number 56, sutta number 11, the Buddha uses the 5 khandhas as a way of relating to the arising of dukkha. And he says the grasping of the aggregates is dukkha, is suffering or unsatisfactoriness, is the difficulty that we can shed by our practice, our skillful practice. So this is a very important framework that the Buddha offered us, and it's one that he taught about many, many, many times. So there is an entire chapter in the Samyutta Nikaya, in the linked discourses, specifically about teachings on the khandhas. And there is another entire chapter in the discourses about Vedana, one of the 5 khandhas. So that word khandha is translated often as aggregates. It means actually like the bulk of the body of an elephant, for example, or the trunk of a thing, the bulk of it. It also means a heap or a pile of things. So that's why we call them aggregates, right? So he's taken, again, various aspects, detailed aspects of our lived experience and grouped them into these kind of piles or these ways, these categories that we can begin to relate to. And so I would like to share my screen for just a moment and show you a little bit of description about the aggregates so that you can learn something about how they operate. And actually, what I'm going to do is have a quick look at this file here. Bear with me for just a moment, folks. We'll be right there. And there we go. So we're going to look at these 5 aggregates. So hopefully you can see that on your screen. And the 5 aggregates of human experience. So we start out with the body, with rupa form. And the form is understood to mean the 4 elements of earth, water, fire, and air. The qualities that they represent also of solidity and smoothing, stickiness is water, and fire is heat, and air as this kind of spaciousness and movement. And so the 4 elements and things that emanate them, like from them. So the body, waste, tears, heat, and these kinds of things. And then we have the next thing is, the next of the 5 aggregates is Vedana. Vedana is best translated as feeling tones. So feeling tones are either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And we can think about them on a spectrum, basically from the most incredibly blissful, blissed out of your mind kind of pleasant state to the most incredibly agonizing, unpleasant state, and everything in between, with the neutral in between. But the Buddha basically summarized them by telling us those 3 modes: pleasant, unpleasant, and neither pleasant nor unpleasant, which we usually think of translated as being neutral. And so Vedana is not emotions necessarily. Emotions are actually more complex and they come in a few minutes. But next we'll go to perceptions, to Sanya. So Sanya is perception, and perception is the way that we identify things, the way that we put a label on it. This is the point at which verbalization comes in. So Vedana is even a pre-verbal, kind of very primitive aspect of the mind. And Sanya is actually, perceptions are actually the way in which we can begin to identify a thing. So when we hear a sound, we might recognize that sound as dog, or we might recognize that sound as plane. So that is the perception itself. And then we have sankhara. So sankhara is a more complex form of mental experience. It basically, we can think about that as the responses and reactions to the things that we perceive. So volition is included there, and this would be emotions as well, would be part of the sankharas. And so you can see that they are all related to each other. They are the body and the mind. So the body is in the center there of your visual. And that is because the body is basically like our interface, or our instrument for interaction with the mind and the rest of the external world. So this is that way in which interactivity is happening, and the mind is learning something about what's going on through what happens in the body as well. So this is one way to think about the aggregates. And viewing our experience this way, we can also begin to have more clarity about the various sorts of conditions, causes and conditions that are present in any given moment. So one aspect of experience related to the 5 khandhas is this idea of contact. The way that the Buddha described contact is that it is when there are 3 things that come into each other's presence. When 3 things are present, then there is contact. And I brought a little prop, a little something for you to have a look at, so that you can kind of get a sense of what's meant here. So the teaching is that when there is, for example, an external visual object, and there is the eye, which is intact, as the Buddha says, a working bodily organ, sense organ of eye, and that is engaged with, there is some engagement. So you can have a look at the larger sutta on the Buddha's footprint, where the Buddha speaks about consciousness engaging with the organs. And when those things are present, then there is a moment of eye consciousness. So it looks something like this. So if there is a light and the light reaches your eye, then hopefully you can see that it sparks a moment of eye consciousness, a mind moment of eye consciousness. And that moment has a beginning and a middle, and an end. That is how it works. So again, there's the contact, and the contact happens, and that creates that moment of consciousness, of eye consciousness. But it also sparks a feeling tone. Anytime there is a contact, it sparks a feeling tone. And that is what I really want to talk about today. Because oftentimes when we reflect on our experience, we don't have the equanimity or the precision or the dispassion to really see these various parts separately. And instead, what happens is that we get swept away. We get swept away. And that is a difficulty, because basically the Buddha said very clearly in Samyutta Nikaya, let's see which one, 2224, in the linked discourse, 22, chapter 22, number 24, the Buddha lays out very specifically, he says, without directly knowing and fully understanding each one of the five aggregates, without becoming dispassionate about them and abandoning them, it is impossible to be liberated. It is impossible to be fully free. So we need to find our ability to not only observe these phenomena, but also our ability to let them be as they are, not be so pushed and pulled by them, not be so dragged around by them, not be so swept away. So I want to give you an example of how this process works. And it's a story about many, many years ago when my daughter was little. So obviously before I was a nun, I had a daughter. Her name is Kayla. She's 32 years old now. I actually began practicing before she was born, but I was a lay woman for about the first 20 years of my practice. And so Kayla was having her third birthday, and I thought it would be really fun to have a little birthday party at her daycare. So she would go to a little preschool daycare kind of place during the day while I was at work. And I thought, well, that would be perfect. We could have the little gathering for her birthday there, the little celebration, because all of her little friends, most of her little friends anyway, would be there already gathered, already together, and would be fun and easy. So I left work at lunchtime that day, and I went to the ice cream store, and I bought a little cup of ice cream for each one of the kids that was going to be there. Just a little small cup of ice cream, and maybe some colored sprinkles, those little candy sprinkle things that you put on top. So some of that for everybody. And I went straight to the daycare, to the preschool from there, from the ice cream shop. And so when I arrived, it was great. The preschool teacher I had already talked to her about this plan. And so she already had the kids already seated at the table. And so my daughter Kayla was at one end, and the kids were lined up along this kind of rectangular table here. And then her hugging buddy was at the other end. There was this little boy who was a really good friend. And they were such good friends that they were always hugging. So I used to call him Hugging Buddy. And so Hugging Buddy was sitting at the other end of the table. And so I got there, and the ice creams are already starting to melt, right? So I start putting down a cup of ice cream in front of each kid. And I put one right in front of this little boy. And then a moment later, the preschool teacher came over to me, and she said, "Oh, no, he can't have that. He can't eat it. He's lactose intolerant. He's not able to digest ice cream." So she picked up the ice cream and took it away from him. And the little boy started crying. He started really crying hard, like sobbing. He was very, very upset, which makes sense, right? One moment he had an ice cream, and then the next moment he didn't have an ice cream. And so he was very sad and upset about this, and crying and crying and crying. And so I felt bad because I didn't know that about him. It didn't even occur to me to bring any other kind of treat for the kids. So I didn't have anything else to give him. But the preschool teacher came over to me and she said, "Well, we have these cookies, and these cookies are very large, and we usually don't give a whole one to the kids because it's too much. But let's go ahead and just give him a whole cookie because he's really upset." So I said, "Okay, great." So she ran to go get the cookie. She came back and she put the cookie in front of the little boy. And he looked at the cookie and he just kept crying. He was so sad. He was still sad, right? Still upset about not having his ice cream. So still the poor little guy is upset. And by this time, the other kids are eating their ice creams, and that's also upsetting, right? That's also very difficult for him. So he's still crying and upset. And the preschool teacher looks at me and I look at her, and we're both sort of like, I don't know what else to do. So she said, "Well, maybe another cookie, maybe one more cookie. That's all we have." So I said, "Okay, well, let's try it." So she goes and she gets another very large cookie for this little 3-year-old boy. And she puts down the cookie. And that moment, you could see that there was a moment where the little boy stopped. He stopped and he had to decide whether he was willing to let go of the dukkha. And in that moment, he decided, yes. And he started eating the cookie. He stopped crying and he started eating his cookie. So now what happened with the little boy, right? What happened was that he had a positive Vedana. He had a pleasant Vedana, a pleasant feeling tone about the ice cream. Even though it's bad for him, and that's actually a mistake, it doesn't matter. He had this pleasant feeling tone about the ice cream. And then when the ice cream gets taken away, unpleasant Vedana arises, right? Unpleasant feeling tone comes up for him. And so then he was swept away by that unpleasant feeling tone, right? And he has this perception that this thing that he wants is being taken away from him. And he has this perception of painful feeling, but he doesn't know that. He only knows that he has this idea that he wanted to eat it, wanted to eat the ice cream. So it's understandable. He's a little guy. He doesn't know. He doesn't understand what's going on in terms of his 5 khandhas, of course. And so, but the interesting part was that at some point, he was faced with the choice of whether to let go of the sad feeling or not, whether to let go of the unpleasant feeling or not. And I would suggest that all of us are like that. We are faced again and again with the choice of whether or not to let go of unpleasant feeling. We are faced with the choice of whether we will be swept away by unpleasant feeling tone, or whether we will be able to observe it. Let it arise, let it be present when it's present, and gone when it's gone. This is a very important aspect of our practice. Choosing when we can not to be swept away by either pleasant or unpleasant or even neutral feeling tone, for that matter. Choosing not to be swept away when we can, and when we notice that we have been swept away, then choosing to set that down and return to the present moment. Return to the present moment. And see what's here. See what's here. So this push of Vedana, this, excuse me, this way that Vedana tends to push us or pull us into strong reactivity is something that is very natural and very strong, and it takes some practice to undo that, to begin to see that we can actually observe this phenomena and not have that kind of reaction to it. So we have to develop first some clarity in being able to observe feeling tone itself. We need to be able to have a bit more precision. Or when we see the sankhara, when we see the reaction, then to learn actually how to sort of roll it back, to look back at what perception is that sankhara based, on what sanya is that based. And then that sanya, on what feeling tone, on what vedana, on what contact was that based? Was it a contact with our mind or with our body? This is an important distinction as well, right? So the Buddha said that we have 6 sense bases. So there's seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking. So the mind, the eyes, the ears, the nose, tongue, skin or body, and mind as a sense organ. So we can have contacts that are happening between thoughts, the mind with the mind, right? This is where I started out, this ability of the mind to reflect on itself and see its own operation, see its own processes and aspects arising. And Vedana has a particularly strong aspect, has a particularly strong role to play in this way of reflecting on the mind, because Vedana is actually bringing us very close to that point of contact. So as I said, there's a contact, there's something that happens that where the form or the sense organ of mind meets a sense object that corresponds to it, and the consciousness is able to interact with that, and then that sparks a feeling tone. So when we observe feeling tone, it means that we're also very close to the contact itself. We're very close to being able to observe the role of consciousness itself in our experience. And that is both a very subtle discernment and a very useful discernment. Because consciousness is oftentimes the aspect of the khandhas, the particular one of the khandhas that we are most tied to, that we feel most belongs to me or defines me or is myself, right? It's very, very easy to get identified with the consciousness as being me. or the consciousness as having such a continuity that it represents something eternal. This is oftentimes where people can get quite confused. So bringing ourselves to understand feeling tone and to use feeling tone as like a marker or a flag or a little alarm that shows us where the contacts are and shows us how the consciousness is operating, where the consciousness is operating. That is very, very useful because, again, it will help us to begin to unpack our experience, to begin to understand our experience as comprised of these 5 different aspects. So what are the aspects again? There's the form, the physical aspect. There is the feeling tone, the Vedana. So rupa is form, Vedana, feeling tone, and then sanya, the perceptions, the way that we label the world, and then sankhara, right? Sankhara, the mental formations, the reactions and volitions that come up in response to what we have perceived or what we have, the tone we have felt. And then 5th is vijnana, consciousness. So the 5 aggregates is a very, very important framework for us to use. And feeling tone, in particular, a very useful aspect of that framework for helping us to observe. And for that reason, we also see feeling tone in many other frameworks that the Buddha offered. So for example, we see feeling tone, Vedana, as the second of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the Satipatthana. So the first Satipatthana is mindfulness of body, and the second Satipatthana is mindfulness of Vedana, of feeling tones. And then third is mindfulness of mind. So notice that the feeling tone is in between those 2. Right? Mindfulness of body, then mindfulness of feeling tone helps us to conduct mindfulness of mind. And then finally, the 4th, Satipatthana, the 4th foundation of mindfulness of Dhammas, of the principles or the qualities that are leading toward awakening, or principles or qualities that are leading away from awakening. So again, the Buddha tells us in the Samyutta Nikaya that without directly knowing and fully understanding these 5 khandhas, we will not be able to become free from dukkha. We will not be able to become sufficiently dispassionate. We will not be able to let go of our clinging to them until we begin to know them directly. But he goes on to say that when we actually are able to do that, when we directly know, when we fully understand, when we find dispassion, when we find our ability to abandon clinging to the 5 aggregates, then we will be liberated. We will find freedom from suffering. It's a very strong statement, a very, very strong statement, and one that should really encourage us to become more skillful about observing these attributes of practice, these attributes of lived experience. So I just brought one more sutta that I wanted to read for you from the Vedana Samyutta. So as I said, there's also an entire chapter here in the linked discourses that is about Vedana, about feeling tones. So this is very, very important. And so I'm going to read you actually 2 very short suttas related to this, and then we'll wrap it up and take some questions. So this is Samyutta Nikaya 36, number 2. So chapter 36 is on Vedana. many discourses on Vedana. And there's several of them that are very, very interesting. For example, on the theme of 108, that's a very beautiful one which alludes to the way that feeling tone is described by the Buddha in many different studies of the mind and body. But nonetheless, I'm just going to read you a short. So we have this. There are these three feelings, says the Buddha. What three? Pleasant feeling, painful feeling, and neither painful nor pleasant feeling. There are these three. And then there is the verse. And the verse says, whether it be pleasant or painful, along with what is neither pleasant nor painful, both the internal and external. So interestingly, both what we observe in what we think of as our inner world, our cognitive world, our mental world, and what we observe externally, external to the body, and in other people, right? That can also be a source of suffering. Whatever kind of feeling there is, having known this is dukkha, perishable, disintegrating, having touched and touched it, pusitva, having touched and touched it. Seeing their, Bhikkhu Bodhi, this is Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, uses seeing their fall. It's wayang, so it's also something like seeing the fact that they go away, that they disappear, that they are always falling apart. Then one loses one's passion for them. So this is quite important. Even just developing that capacity to see the Vedana arise, persist for some time, and disappear over and over again will eventually train our minds to dispassion, to knowing that something so fleeting, something so ephemeral is not worth holding on to. How could it be worth clinging to? How could it be worth setting up and defining my sense of identity on such a thing? It wouldn't make sense. So this, having touched it again and again and again, pusitva, I really appreciate that. In fact, the Buddha uses that phrase many times in the discourses. Kayena pusitva, specifically having touched it with the body, this way that we can have a very visceral experience, a very embodied experience. Knowing it in your bones. I like this kind of translation of it, knowing it in your bones. So this deep embodied experience that comes from this mental capacity for reflection. And finally, this last one on Vedana. So just again to really encourage us to go all the way. The Buddha says, again, there are these three feelings, pleasant, painful, neither painful nor pleasant. And then the verse, a disciple of the Buddha, mindful, concentrated, comprehending clearly, understands Vedana and the origin of Vedana and where it finally ceases, where they finally cease, and the path leading to their destruction. So if we know that all contact produces a Vedana, then where would we see the destruction of Vedana? Nibbana, in the unconditioned where there is no contact. So the path leading to their destruction, with the destruction of Vedana, a bhikkhu, or I would say any committed practitioner, is free from hunger and fully quenched. Free from clinging and desire and fully quenched. So may you find May you really use this capacity that you have. You can't say that you don't have it. The tool, you have it. It is merely a matter of beginning to use it in a way that is skillful, that is clear, that is following the instructions of the Buddha, and you will see the benefit. You will see the beautiful, beautiful wisdom and insight that arises. So thank you so much for your attention and your practice. And thank you for taking care of your lives in this way of coming and participating in a Dhamma talk on a lovely Sunday. Wonderful. So it's been beautiful to be here with you all. And unless there are any questions or brief comments there, then we'll wrap it up for today. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you again, Bhante, for having me. It's been a beautiful morning of Dhamma. Bye-bye.